For disabled people to thrive, we need webs of help, support, understanding, and care. But in an able-bodied literary world, we're all expected to succeed on our own, never to need assistance. Until we change that paradigm, it will be incredibly hard for most disabled people to finish and send out their work into the world. That is from a disabled Canadian writer called A.H. Room. And even though it is talking about that more from a literary perspective, I think building that sense of support is very much part of why we need to talk amongst each other and build communities, and why charities like this are important, and was a very core motivation of my book as well. So I'm going to read a passage which explains about my early experiences with, the previous one, passage 1. About my earliest memories of diagnosis. And after passage 1, I will open up the floor a bit to you guys, and these are some of the questions we'll be thinking about. When did I get diagnosed, and what was life like back then? In 1994, I was diagnosed with dyspraxia, and I was unable to do all the things that children are expected to do by the time they're in school. For me, this included everything from riding a bike and catching a ball to reading, writing, and basic math. According to a family legend, I couldn't even understand why an orange, as in the fruit, was orange. I asked my father why I had medical tests pre-diagnosis, and he recalled an incident where I lost control of my balance and fell down the stairs. Although it likely had something to do with everyone's concerns about how slowly I was learning how to get dressed, walk, and tie my shoelaces without help. Then once I finally learned how to write, additional challenges emerged. Holding a pen or pencil in my hands was extremely painful, and no one could read my handwriting. Gripping my pen and squeezing it tightly in between my middle and index finger was the only way I could write. Otherwise, my pen would fall out of my hands mid-sentence. So my parents did what most logical parents would do and took me to the doctor. I got sent to several specialists at a major Canadian children's hospital. I had blood tests, MRIs, appointments with physiotherapists and occupational therapists, speech pathology testing, and psychological assessments. I hated every minute of it. Being outside in the sunshine seemed a lot more appealing than sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room. Several appointments later, my parents received a phone call from my family doctor announcing my diagnosis, dyspraxia. I don't remember how I found out about it, but it was probably handled a bit like how my father tells me about a death in the family. He waits until I'm comfortably seated, as his Oxfordshire accent suddenly includes an aura of soft gentleness. Then he explains what this means for me and everyone else we care about. In the Canadian big city region of Toronto that I grew up in, 1994 was also the year of budget cuts to healthcare and education. The medical team responsible for my diagnosis had to test and diagnose me with limited resources. It was a slow process, and all my parents got was an outdated pamphlet on clumsy child syndrome. When I was diagnosed, my mother was reading a book about a man who has propagnasia, a medical condition where you cannot recognize faces. Learning more about someone who has a neurological condition that makes him see the world differently helped her understand what having a daughter who also sees the world differently for similar reasons could be like. More recently, my dad recommended a movie called The Last Detail, where Randy McQuaid's character is neurodiverse. He told me it influenced him a great deal when he was a young man, and it was his first introduction to neurodiversity. On a global level, there are so many dyspraxics with stories that deserve to be told, but I think that you'll be interested in my story for one very important reason. I have known that I have dyspraxia, otherwise known as developmental coordination disorder, for as long as I can remember. I never had to figure out how dyspraxia affected who I was as a person, because it has always been a background presence in my life. My peers bullied and teased me when I was in school, and it made me wish that I had never received a diagnosis. Once I struggled with other health issues, I no longer felt that way. If you haven't developed good coping mechanisms, your chances of thriving are lower. Confronting everyone else's expectations about womanhood. Other people's expectation about the person I was supposed to be were so unrealistic that I immersed myself in Harry Potter, Series of Unfortunate Events, and Chronicles of Narnia novels instead. These books were an enormous source of comfort for me because the protagonists were relatable people who also struggled to fit in, but who were eventually, spoiler alert, welcomed with open arms in mythical worlds where their identity was an advantage. As I read these books, I daydreamed about the day when someone somewhere would accept me for who I am. I'm biologically a woman, but many of the expectations that came with being a woman made no sense to me. There were too many knots to tie, buttons to maneuver, and clasps to navigate. Whenever I got dressed, the buttons and complex knots of women's clothing were a source of frustration. I put my clothes on in such a wonky fashion that I moved around stiffly for the rest of the day. Trading in my clasp and button-heavy clothes for button and knot-free alternatives was a start, but every day it took multiple tries for my clothes to not be inside out and backwards. Getting dressed was a lot less frustrating when I hyper-focused on the process of putting my clothes on. This made it possible for me to focus on the details of the clothing and not lose track of what I did 2 seconds ago. When I was a preteen girl, I was always late for something. Hyper-focusing when you're in a hurry is impossible. To work around this challenge, I allowed a lot more time to get dressed in the morning and get up earlier, but I'm not a morning person. I have always struggled with turning off my hyperactive brain at night. Eventually, I fixed that problem once getting to bed and waking at a certain time became a routine. This minor adjustment was totally worth it for not having to walk around all day with the knowledge that my clothes were on backwards and my zippers and buttons were wonky. Sensory sensitivity has also made wearing clothes so much more complicated. My preteen years were a time when I learned the hard way which fabrics irritated me to the point of all-day distraction and which fabrics were tolerable. I learned what I can tolerate through a painful trial and error process, but this process had to be balanced out with feeling good in what I'm wearing. Both these factors really matched up perfectly. At that age, I had so much left to learn about what being a woman means, but the idea of womanhood a lot of us are exposed to is someone's attempt at trying to sell something anyways.